Hi, my name's Mark from Canny Gaming. This is the second in the series of planning in workers and resources. I started with episode 1 on highways, and we built a fairly extensive highway network all in one go, connecting the customs house to the main industrial area and the main city. Though you may have noticed there's no city yet. That's coming soon, I hope. Episode 1 features mainly time-lapse recorded in-game, with only a little commentary from me about the actual building process. Now, I want to introduce a slightly different format into the series where we talk more informally about the details of building the Republic. And while I told myself that I didn't want to create a series about how to mod the game, I can say that I'm going to be fairly heavily reliant on modding in this series. And people will want at least some of this to be explained, not just brushed over quickly in a time lapse. I finished episode 1 with this screenshot. And for instance, the picture and text is not superimposed onto it. This is generated by a script within the game, like those used by the developers in the tutorials and campaign mode. I'm not going to cover how I did that today, but I do want to follow on from the picture of the highway in the background to that text, and some of the final time-lapse. Because you may have spotted that these were taken from a later save of the Republic that is not what was shown in the main time-lapse. This highway differs in appearance from what you saw me build, so this is somewhat of a discussion of improving the appearance of the highway and about using some modding to achieve that. If you're only interested in the functionality, how to get a fast road connecting your cities, then you might want to skip this video. That's okay. I'm not interested in getting people to sit and watch a video for 40 minutes if the content isn't going to be relevant to them. For that reason, I hesitate whether to describe this as episode 2. It is a supplement to episode 1, 1A if you like, rather than an entirely new project. But I've decided at this stage to put it out as episode 2 to keep the order a little clearer. For myself, if nothing else. I'm happy to take feedback on that. Okay, let's get on with the main discussion. I mentioned in episode 1 about the markings drawn on the surface of the asphalt 2-lane road when it was made into one direction, that I didn't particularly care for the fact that it had arrows all the way along the carriageways, though I did like the road marking up the centre of the 2 lanes. I've been looking at a mod fairly recently that made various changes that had taken my interest, because it changed the markings of the factory connection amongst other things. I'd used a mod a couple of years ago that changed the factory connections, but I had lost that when I had to rebuild my PC recently. I don't like the vanilla factory connections with all of the yellow triangles. I think that they are too brightly coloured and stand out too much when you're looking at a factory from a distance. It's possible to modify the game files to take the markings off the factory connections completely, so that all you're left with is a piece of asphalt connecting 2 factories together, or a factory to a warehouse, etc. Or you can change those markings, for instance make them white instead of yellow. Anyway, while I looked at that mod, I realised, well, actually, the game files that tell them program what road markings to show on the surface of one-way roads. So I changed the road markings on the 2-lane roads when they are in one direction. They do not have arrows on now, but they do still have the central lane down the middle. The game still understands it is one direction, it's just not displayed with the arrows, that's the only difference. And then I realised, well, there's another game file that's easily modded as well, which has arrows for the 1-lane roads. The slip roads that are always in one direction. I did consider whether to take the road markings off the slip roads completely, but what I've done is half the number of arrows. So the vanilla game file had 2 arrows on a section of road. I dropped it down to 1 single arrow. So you can see how that works on this junction outside the customs house. The 2 carriageways of the highway don't have arrows drawn on the road surface anymore. The single lane roads do have arrows, but not as many arrows as they were originally. On this footage, the roundabout still has arrows. Despite the change to the game files, the game seems to remember that arrows were originally drawn on the surface and won't remove them, despite removing them from all of the carriageways and one of the other roundabouts. To get rid of them, I was forced to rebuild the roundabout, which I did off camera. Second thing that I did to improve the looks of what I'd done was not actually a mod. The devs gave us a standard feature to paint areas of the ground under the same menu for monuments and trees. We can draw a gravel road or a gravel square. The gravel road is not something that can be curved like a normal road. It is just a long rectangle of gravel. Although it is described as a gravel road on the game menu, it is actually the same width as a path. You can make it as long as you want. I hadn't really used that before, but I had used the gravel square, which is much more common in gameplay videos. You can draw a square out and you can draw various different sizes of rectangles that allow you to paint a fairly big piece of ground with it. The nice thing about this is that it respects the terrain. It's been drawn on the surface of ground that is not entirely flat. The issue I hadn't discussed before was that in the standard game, where you have two parallel roads, you cannot draw them close enough so they join up to each other. There's always a small gap, and that is then rendered on the screen as a narrow strip of mud. It's not really wide enough for there to be any vegetation, or at least grass doesn't seem to appear there. Though strangely, if you paint the area with random trees, you will probably get one or two trees that grow in that little strip of ground, even if you don't want them there. But it's very difficult to deliberately place any trees there because it is so narrow. It's so narrow that you can't put things like overhead electric wires or fences there, nothing that has collision. So I filled that in with gravel using those tools. I used the gravel road up the long gaps and filled wider areas near the intersections using the gravel square. Note, these tools don't draw the gravel over the top of the proper roads and any buildings. It goes underneath the roads and footpaths. So it's not a problem that the gravel strip is actually wider than the mud strip down the middle. So to note that these tools don't have any collision. They are happy to be drawn in the same area as other things. So they are very commonly used to quickly paint the ground on the areas around buildings such as factories. Areas where you might not want any vegetation to be shown. By the way, some countries have some highways that have a median down the centre between the carriageways that are about 5 to 10 metres wide, and they could even be 10 to 20 metres. So they frequently have grassed areas, and they've often got things in them, not just lights and road signs. If you really wanted to, you could draw out two carriageways that are properly separated like that. Then you could put more things in that gap. Like this, for instance, by drawing 3 parallel mud roads and then making the outer ones as the two carriageways, then deleting the centre one. I then had the idea to use the gravel road to draw along the outside of the carriageway. So you get something looking like a typical safety lane, what we would call in the UK a hard shoulder, an area where you can pull off the main carriageway in an emergency if you have a breakdown or there's a crash or something like that. This additional lane might be asphalt, but historically it was sometimes painted or rendered in a different colour, so it's clear it's not part of the main 2 or 3 lanes of the carriageway. Occasionally you get it so that it's literally just a flat piece of grass by the side of the road, or is a fairly rough piece of asphalt or gravel. To note, this sort of safety feature was missing in the real life roadway we viewed in Košice, but I'm happy to include it here. Looking very closely at the highway I've made, it's not perfect, but that's a general issue that the actual carriageway is an asphalt road with lights, which is not really designed for highways. It's designed for use within a city where you have both pedestrians and vehicles using the roadway, so that it renders on the map a roadway for the vehicles and a paved footpath along the side of it. So you can still see that proper footpath alongside the highway that I built. So that maybe doesn't look quite realistic, given pedestrians are usually banned from walking along highways. The limitations on the tools that we have, with just 4 main types of formed roads, means that if I modded that to not display the footpath, which is possible, then we would also not have a footpath displayed everywhere else we use that road type on the map, including in the cities. Anyway, I think this is a small thing. Looked at from a distance, it certainly makes the road more noticeable in the landscape to have both the footpath and the gravel road drawn alongside of it. And I think it looks more like a proper highway. I think overall it looks better now. I mentioned I took off the arrows that are painted on the road surface, but it's fairly normal on a roundabout to have direction arrows on signposts, so that people, when they approach the roundabout, have a visual indication that they're turning to the right or turning to the left in the UK. And by the way, I have stuck to European, driving on the right. Yes, driving on the right. I have to think about it twice. So I used a mod that's available from the workshop to place some road signs. They're just ploppable assets with no collision, so you can just drop them onto the roundabout. So there's a visual sign of where the traffic should go. Of course, the traffic doesn't actually care. This is just a visual thing, a small detail. By the way, the removal of the arrows on the road also don't matter to the traffic AI. It would still understand that a roadway used the one-way tool was one way, whether the arrows are drawn on it or not. But that might be a bit of a challenge for me, that if I draw them the wrong way, it's not immediately obvious. That's something for me to consider later if I make any changes or build new roundabouts. On the same theme, I thought I can improve the roundabouts. There's a nice circular flower bed mod with a red star among many options I could have used to make it look nicer. And I decided to put a bit of vegetation on them, which still needs to grow. You could also include a monument in the roundabout. They are big enough for that. But monuments need to be constructed and maintained, so they must have footpaths connecting them. So I would be cautious about doing that, especially as I'm not sure that monuments have any effect unless they're built close to where people live. If you know whether that's right or not, put it in the comments please. I'd love to hear about that. Anyway, these sort of flower bed props are free and don't need any maintenance. They're purely for appearance. I mentioned that you can't fit a fence in the gap between the two carriageways, but there's nothing to stop you putting one along the side of the carriageways, though you can't get very close to the edge of the road. And I noticed there was a mod in the workshop that changes one of the default fences to look like a metal crash barrier. It's not possible for a modder to create additional fences that would appear in the game, but you can change the game file so that the appearance of the vanilla ones is different. Of course, it means that you can no longer use that original fence type, but we've got about 8 or 9 different types of fence, and the one that was being changed was not one that I had much used ever and didn't have elsewhere on this map. So it's almost perfect for the idea of putting on a highway. Now, the only thing with it is that it's on the screen now, but I think if I didn't tell you it's there, you may not even spot it. The fence is very small. You can just about see it on the edge of the gravel path that I've drawn out as the safety lanes. There is a sort of shiny metal thing, and that is the crash barrier. If I change the angle, it's maybe more visible. It's hard to get it to look right on the slip roads, especially on the terraformed land where it is not flat. But in most cases, because it acts as a proper fence and is quite flexible in terms of having curves or being straight, you can get it to follow the carriageways fairly well. It would be nice to put it up the middle, but the collision prevents that. There is a mod that gives concrete barriers, which are ploppable assets without collision. 3 colours, but all the same basic idea of the type of concrete barriers that are movable, can be used in some countries during roadworks. And some countries definitely use something like these down the middle of highways as permanent barriers. They are stronger and more robust if hit by large trucks than the small metal crash barriers. But as these assets are only short, then to use them to fill all the way down the middle of the carriageways would mean placing hundreds of them on the map, one at a time. I haven't done it. I didn't really have the patience for that, to be honest, though I think it would work pretty well. What's interesting I noticed from the video of driving on a real Slovakian motorway is they have often used these sort of concrete barriers that this asset represents in combination with the metal crash barriers under bridges or in other places where they need something that has that extra safety. But in some modern highways they've gone for 100% concrete barriers, especially down the centre, though they tend to be concrete walls permanently fixed to the ground. Anyway, none of this affects the functionality whatsoever, and we might even argue that none of it is even relevant to the appearance of the highway when it was first built in our alternate reality in the 1950s. None of it is essential. We already had a nearly 100% functional highway. There's a few niggles with the way the game operates with the traffic, but it's really minor. Except to note that if you have a connection with slip roads merging, the game will cause at least one of the roads to slow down and yield to the other traffic. The vehicles slow down to 50 kilometers per hour, which is still much faster than if there was a corner. But you can generally solve that by telling the traffic AI which road has priority using the crossroads tool. It's not ideal that they can place the road signs on the map in odd positions, but it works, and those signs are really only obvious in first-person camera mode. I thought I would share that with you. You will see the improved highway in future episodes, and you might wonder what had changed and when. And I learned a little bit more about modding the game, and that was useful to me. To note, I am not an expert on modding. Lots of this is being worked out as I go along. Just to elaborate about the factory connections, I took the mod that changed the markers on the factory connection and modded that mod, if that makes sense. So my factory connections now look like this. That's not currently in the workshop, it's just for my own use. You see that I changed the arrows to be white, though I left the small warning signs to be yellow. I don't want this series to turn into some sort of modding tutorial, nor be mainly about appearances. Still, I am happy to say clearly that I will be using modded assets in this series. I do not understand people who put out videos where they never use a modded asset. That doesn't make any sense to me. There's hundreds and hundreds of really excellent assets in the workshop. Factories, apartment blocks, schools, vehicles, you name it, it is there. Now, some of them cheat, I've no doubt about that. And if I see an asset in the workshop and there's any comments like, the vanilla would cost you X amount of resources to build and this one half of that, then I don't take it. If there's anything where it does anything really way out, or tries to get around what I think are reasonable gameplay limitations, like storing 50 tons of concrete in the concrete plant, I pass on those. But you know, there's loads of excellent stuff, and there's people who must have spent months creating whole series of buildings that are just absolutely fantastic, and they went out of their way to make sure their mods complied with the standards set in the vanilla mods. If they employ half the number of people, they produce half the amount of resources, etc. I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't have a look at what's available. And in that spirit of the role play that this highway was created sometime before 1960, then I deleted the vanilla gas station and used this modded retro style one instead. It would be nice to mod that mod and remove the Cyrillic lettering on the roof, which I suspect is Russian rather than Czechoslovakian, but I haven't worked out how to change that yet. If you have an idea, point me in the right direction, please. Anyway, I haven't got any issues with using most mods. You will see them being used by me, and I will usually point out where I'm using a mod, though I have so many I often won't remember who produced it and be able to give them credit in the audio. but at least you will know to go looking for it in the workshop if it's something that you want to use in your game. If it is particularly relevant to the video, then I will try to ensure I include a link to the mod in the description of the video. I'm also happy to answer questions about the mods I have used in the comments below. And if they're mods I have developed that people want to use, then I guess I could publish them on the workshop. So you know now we're going to do some big projects, and we're not going to spend weeks of episodes following around dumper trucks on mud roads, trying to build a couple of apartment blocks to move in a few workers. Don't get me wrong, I like things like Party Elite series on the new Arab Desert biome and highly recommend it. But there are many examples on YouTube of that sort of approach to playing the game. I'm going to have a go at producing something quite a bit different, and hopefully a few people will find it interesting. As I've worked on the first few videos and crystallised my thoughts better, I see that the biggest difference is the use of mods. Party Elite is about 15 episodes in and not used a single mod, though he mentioned he's not ruled it out. But many other major content providers say explicitly they will never use any mods and will only use vanilla assets. Now Steven Silverbeard is different, that he has an early start series starting back in about 1908, and then has even used horse-drawn carriages before rather than trucks, or very early combustion engine vehicles. That's interesting to me. It's something a bit different. The game developers allow early starts and modded vehicles, and you can then make the vehicles not only look like a horse-drawn cart, but make them run much slower than a truck, and then progress through the 20th century into the period that we would typically refer to as the Soviet era in Eastern Europe, from about 1945 to 1990. You don't have to start the game in 1960, and to be honest, it is not exactly historic, though I understand the use of that from a simple game design point of view. In real life in 1960 in Czechoslovakia, the Communist Party had already been in power for over 10 years. But also, I think that it's unrealistic that a republic starts off with nothing, open virgin territory. Even Siberia had infrastructure and cities before this period, and history shows us that only a few completely new cities were ever built anywhere in the Soviet countries, covering such a vast area of the world's land surface. Košice, for example, was first referred to in written records around 1230. We're not going to create a medieval republic, but the relevance for us is to be inspired by the fact that Košice, Bratislava, Prague, Warsaw, Bucharest, East Berlin, Budapest, Sofia, etc. all existed before the Soviet army arrived. All existed with houses and industries, power plants, water and sewage systems, shops and theatres, and fairly large populations. And as I mentioned in episode 1, even started with trucks, personal cars and motorbikes, as well as buses and trams. And in some cases, particularly in East Germany, even with the autobahns that existed there before any motorways were built in capitalist Britain or the interstates built in the US. I showed gameplay video for building the highway with the game time set in 1960-61. Though I mentioned that the roleplay was the idea that the highway had been built before 1960. In order to avoid any confusion over that, I think I should actually set the year in the game before 1960 and explicitly state when the work we are doing is taking place, either in an earlier pre-Soviet period or in that initial Soviet period between the war and 1960. And as much as possible, follow a meaningful timeline. I say that it could be confusing that we have a highway connecting to a city that doesn't exist and that has arisen from nothing with no signs of the construction industry that would be necessary to build something like this. I need a city and I need a lot more industry. I've settled on the locations for them and proposed some names. To be clear, spoiler alert, I'm not going to build a 1960s city of a dozen big prefabricated tower blocks there, packed in as close as the game will allow. I'm going to create and then develop a city inspired by Košice. So while my republics don't have churches built by the state, and I'm happy to follow anti-religious measures as part of improving citizen loyalty, there will be a cathedral, for instance. The Communist Party inherited Košice as a fully formed city with old buildings and a cathedral. They may have made plenty of errors, but they didn't tear it all down and start again from scratch. They built alongside what was already there. The historical centre of Košice still remains pretty much as it was in 1918 and 1945. This idea is not even unique to me. The game developers provided that you can start a map with existing roads and cities, and even that those cities could be populated, so that you start the game in 1960 or 1970 with an existing population of thousands of citizens. Yet, video after video avoids this way of playing. Perhaps the game developers totally misunderstood the player base, that everyone would only want to play like in SimCities or City Skylines, that you are the mayor of a city starting from absolutely nothing. And the only main difference is that Workers and Resources has a more Eastern European style rather than an American one, and a more clearly centrally planned economy than capitalist. But I think there must be plenty of people out there who are interested in the idea of building an old-style republic, what it would look like, how it would work before the Communist Party took power, then develop from that a more modern republic from that starting point. There's certainly plenty of people who've developed pre-Soviet era assets in the workshop. That is the contrast that I want to bring, and as I have formed that idea in my mind, I realise that I will need to use tools in the game and features provided by the developers that are not well represented in most gameplay videos, even after 5 years of early access. And we need to include lots of mods. To do this in the way I wanted, I have quickly realised I would have to mod some of these mods or even create my own mods, or just in some cases fix mods that have been around for years that the original modders are no longer actively supporting. Mods that still look good that I want to use, but are missing some of the important functionality added later by the developers. So I guess I have an interest in what my cities look like, not just the functionality, and modded assets are great at providing a variety of appearances, including many that look like they were built before the Soviet era. But on the other hand, I'm not going to try to do what I've seen some people do with City Skylines, where it's largely building things for the appearances. Their cities often look fantastic, even when viewed in a cinematic mode with a first-person ride through the city. But we don't have the same tools available to us in Workers and Resources than in some big budget games. Plus, I want things that are still fully functional. My priority in the first video was always to produce a useful and entirely functional highway, not a beautiful one. Making it look good and then even further improving on that was an unexpected bonus for me that I'm happy to include in the series in this sort of supplemental video. And depending on feedback, I'll do similar with other topics in future. In the time-lapse, you've been watching me rebuild the 2 bridges that I made before in episode 1. I wasn't entirely happy with them afterwards because they are at a little bit of an angle. This one more so, though that's partly to do with the way the road itself approaches the original road. So the road from the customs comes at a little bit of an angle to this road. You can see as the vehicles go through the bridge, the road starts to turn where the intersection was built. But the earlier bridge was a kind of mistake, and every time I looked at it, I wasn't entirely happy with it, that it was not at 90 degrees to the highway underneath. I did notice this when I recorded the time lapse. I remember the slip roads on either side were already built, and it would not let me build the bridge in exactly the angle that I wanted. Anyway, it wasn't a big issue to me. But then I remembered that I had these pylon mods, and when I looked into how they work, I realised I would have to demolish and rebuild both bridges. Even if they were perfect, I would have had to do that. It's one mod with 5 parts to it, and that bit there on the left is the bit that I really wanted to include that then fills in under the bridge, and I think that looks really good. The real-life bridges, at least older ones, are not generally a suspended deck that is held up only on pillars. If there are reinforced concrete supports, then you often don't see them. They are hidden behind brick, stone or concrete walls. So these brick or stone type infills are very common in lots of places. But to put brick walls under the bridge in the game, the bridge ramp must be either 50 metres or 100 metres long. So there's 4 assets available. There's a 50 metres one with a 9 metre rise, which I am using, and 3 other combinations of length and height, including 12 metres high. You know, I said 12 metres would be very high over that carriageway, but there might be circumstances where you do need to use a 12 metre high road bridge, maybe over a river where you need to get that height. So the 4 sets of sloped pylons are available, but you must make the bridge meet those criteria, otherwise the brick infill will not be at the correct angle and will leave some gaps. It's awkward to do. They are quite big assets to position exactly, particularly when your view of what's happening is a bit restricted by the bridge. You can't place the asset down first, even though it's a ploppable asset and has no collision on it, because once it is built, the bridge itself, which does have collision on it, would then say, no, I can't build a bridge here where there's this thing underneath. There must be nothing in the way of the bridge. But you can do it the opposite way, as you saw me doing. You can build the bridge and then place the asset underneath it. But as I said, it's a little awkward then to say exactly what you're doing. So there are the 4 sort of triangle shaped walls, but there's another one which you saw me using, which is not sloped, and it is 9 metres high. There's also a 12 metre one of those as well. And that was quite useful on the far side of the bridge where the partial cloverleaf is. I couldn't use a sloped one to fill all that in, although in real life it is also not a floating deck on pillars. In fact, what they had used on the far side of the bridge in real life is to raise the level of the ground, much the way I've done on this particular bridge. So the assets can't be used on a curve. It is 50 metres long, 9 metres high, and it's straight. That's it. That's all you get. So you have to make the roads fit. On the far side of the first bridge, I largely kept the floating deck supported by some pillars, except that I then infilled close to the carriageway with one of the wide brick pylons. Sorry, I say one. I think I used 2 or 3 of them. The collision, or should I say the lack of collision, is great because it allows you to overlap the assets. And if you place the assets very, very close to each other, it's not even obvious that there's more than one asset there. They sort of blend into each other. So I did that on the far side to make a more substantial brick pillar that was looking like it's holding up the bridge. And I also extended out the triangle sloping walls on the near side, on the side where the clothing factory is, with a couple of those rectangles just to fill close up to the roadway. Now on the second bridge, on the left side towards the customs, the walls were very close already to the carriageway and I didn't need to fill that any further. So I guess the lesson would be to start the sloping part of the bridge from about 54 or 55 metres away from the carriageway, make it 50 metres long exactly, and then go level over the carriageways. And that leaves a little bit of room on either side that I have filled with the gravel road and metal crash barrier that I explained earlier. I hadn't planned it, but on the left side, once I changed the sloping ramp of the bridge to be only 50 metres long instead of around 55, then the triangle shaped asset does fit just. On the right hand side, I could have used the idea that I've used on the first bridge. It would be tight, but I think 1 or 2 of the straight pylons could probably be built right into the slope of the ground, but they might come right up through the surface of the bridge. I'm not sure how they would work with the height differences. But there's another asset from a completely different mod that I used. You saw me struggling with it at first and I left the footage in rather than cut that, so you would understand if you used this asset yourself. I struggled with it because I had it turned 90 degrees to the angle it should be used. Because it can disappear into the terrain, it also has no collision. Then I couldn't figure it out at first why it didn't seem to blend in with the slope. This particular mod has 3 assets which are described as 1 line, 2 lines and 3 lines, and I think it's intended for railway bridges so you know which asset to use. So it's 3 different widths, but I couldn't see that at first when most of it was actually underground. But once I figured out that I needed to rotate at 90 degrees, then either the 2 or the 3 line asset fits fairly well underneath the road bridge. The only thing I would say is that with very old railway and some road bridges, especially from the 19th century and early 20th, these can be stone or sometimes brick, but more modern ones are usually a concrete wall, and the one in Košice was concrete. With just the 2 bridges so far, then the single look for them is okay, but these assets look like you could easily apply a set of skins to them to give them some variety of appearance. In any case, both of these mods are available in the workshop, though currently without any skins, and I think overall significantly improve the looks of the bridges, so I'll definitely be using them again. I think it's worth the effort to improve the bridges, certainly when you have, in this case, the bridges going over an important highway, which is very visible when you are following the vehicles, and especially in first person mode. There you go, a little bonus at the end as we further improve the highway. I'm not going to spend the whole series developing roads and intersections, but there is one mod that I also want to explain, which you've seen in the footage and which I haven't discussed, which is the signs which are elevated over the carriageways. That will be done as a separate sort of tutorial in its own video, as I want to be able to link to that in the workshop, and then I will come back to properly developing this Republic. If you found that interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe. My name is Mark and I'm from Canny Gaming, and I'm out of here.